Hello everyone, Aldrich here, and in this video I want to talk about the short story 9 Billion Names of God by Arthur C. Clarke. This story was published in 1953. It won a retrospective Hugo Award in 1954, and it's a really fun short story. It's only 7 pages long, and you see just the size of the questions that Clarke can bring to a story of such short length. So if you haven't read the story, I of course suggest that you read it. I'm going to say that I'm going to spoil the story right now by just quickly explaining the plot. So in 9 Billion Names of God, 2 engineers named Chuck and George travel from the United States to a lamasery in Tibet, where they are helping the monks with a very important task. The monks believe that if they find all 9 billion names of God, that the universe will end. For some reason, they want this to happen. And in order to expedite their mission, they've incorporated a Mach 5 supercomputer. This is where Chuck and George come in. They're representatives from the company who created the computer. So they go to Tibet and they see that the monks have already transformed some elements of the religious practice into more modern or technologically augmented versions of their traditions. For example, they have motors turning the prayer wheels so that the prayer wheels will be spinning continuously. We see that the monks are not rejecting the science. Oftentimes when we think about the ontological struggle between science and religion, we see that people are at odds in their conversation and in their beliefs. The monks, they're not really at odds with Chuck and George, though Chuck and George are very much at odds with the monks. They don't believe that the monks' mission is legitimate. They don't believe that if you find all 9 billion names of God, the universe is going to end. At one point, they predict that if the computer completes the task, then the monks are going to have to revise their belief. Oh, there must be more names, or wait, it didn't quite work right, or we need to do it again. Or the monks are not going to be successful. Chuck and George are 100% sure that the monks are not going to be successful, to the point that when the process is nearing its end, they fear that the monks are going to be angry with them for the failure of the computer to identify all the names, or if it does identify all the names, that they will be mad that the universe doesn't end. So Chuck and George start sneaking away so that they don't end up on the monks' bad side. They look up at the sky, and lo and behold, the stars are going out. The monks have completed their task, and Chuck and George are surprised. So we know that Arthur C. Clarke was a rationalist. Arthur C. Clarke was not a religious man, and he often spoke on behalf of science as the primary ontological system that we should use to structure our societies and communities. So what is he trying to say in this story where the monks, the religious people, are employing the technology that the engineers developed to complete a religious end, to complete their religious goal? And why does Clarke have their goal succeed? So I have a few theories about this, but first I want to touch on a couple of the science fiction points that we might be thinking about. If the stars are going out in the sky, of course that means that all those stars went out a long time ago, because it takes the light from the stars to travel to Earth a long time to travel from wherever they are to Earth. And so it really is impossible for the stars to start blinking out. If that were to happen, it would probably be a phenomenon in our own atmosphere, nothing to do with the stars. So we're just going to table that. I don't think that's Clarke's point in this particular story. I'll bring up another kind of really interesting and fascinating point that one of my students had shared with me. If we think about the monk's task of using a computer to identify all the 9 billion names of God and end the universe, what Clarke has predicted here is something like a brute force password attack. Like if you're a hacker and you're trying to find someone's password, you would use a computer program, an algorithm, to generate all the different possible combinations that would fit the parameters of that password until it identifies the correct one. So Arthur C. Clarke's prescient about how computers will work in the future back in 1953. So those 2 points aside, why do we have a story by a rationalist like Clarke that is claiming that the religious goal of the monks succeeds at the end through the use of the computer? Well, I want to say that this whole story is a metaphor. The computer is a metaphor, and the monks are metaphorical, and so are the scientists. So what are they metaphors for? Well, Clarke wrote this story in 1953, only 8 years after America dropped the nuclear bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And at this point we see that the world is developing nuclear weapons. It's sort of the outset of the Cold War, and people are very cognizant of the bomb. In fact, some of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project and developed that bomb turned around and started the League of Atomic Scientists, who published the Doomsday Clock. You can look that up online. The Doomsday Clock is always a little bit before midnight. Presumably if it gets to midnight, then there will be a nuclear catastrophe. These scientists are always gauging the socio-political environment throughout the world to try to give us an idea how close we are to that nuclear catastrophe, and the Doomsday Clock is the gauge by which they communicate that. So the scientist who created the bomb later came out and tried to create something to mitigate the damage that had been done by their creation in the hands of other people. And so this is what I see as the foundational metaphor in 9 Billion Names of God. Chuck and George represent the company that created the computer. They understand how the computer works, the parameters of science that dictates the underlying mechanisms by which it runs, and they have a scientific, logic-based view of the universe. Now the monks, they don't care about how the computer runs. They don't care about the circuits, they don't care about the design, they don't care about the hardware or the software. They care about their traditional religious beliefs. To them, that computer may as well be a magic item, and they don't really care how it came about. When we think about that as a metaphor for the bomb, well, didn't the scientists design the bomb? Don't the scientists and engineers know the intricacies of how that device works? But were they the ones to choose how it was used? Were there any of the people on the Manhattan Project who said, yes, we should drop those bombs on innocent people, innocent civilians in Nagasaki and Hiroshima? No, instead they came out against that sort of behavior after the fact. So here we see Chuck and George functioning like those scientists, right? They've designed something that has great power, that has great potential, but it's not their ideology, it's not their ontology that decides how that device is used. Anyone else who doesn't understand it at all can take it and they can use it to further their own ends, they can further their own purposes, just like the monks do in finding all 9 billion names and ending the universe, just like politicians have done using weapons and weapon systems designed by scientists in grossly unethical ways, like killing mass numbers of civilians. So if we think about this story as an artifact of its time period, Clarke again is sort of prescient. He's thinking forward, right? He's thinking about, well, what could potentially happen as science and technology get more advanced. He's in a moment where great destruction is possible in ways that it never could have been before. I mean, really, is a nuclear holocaust that different for the people who experience it from the end of the universe? I mean, scientifically it is, but if you're at the end of a bomb, or if you're in a world where the stars are going out and everything's going to end, your experience will be the same. It's death and destruction. So this is my understanding of the story. I think it's a metaphor for particularly nuclear technology. It's a Cold War story. It doesn't deal with the interaction between science and religion. It does, but I think here religion is standing in for all ideological systems that are not scientific based. Why do I think that's the case? Well, because Arthur C. Clarke, he didn't live in Sri Lanka at the time that he wrote that story, but he'd spent time in Asia. He later lived in Sri Lanka for many years, and in this story he grossly misrepresents the goals, beliefs, and ends of Buddhism. I don't really think that Clarke was that culturally insensitive necessarily. I do think that he cared about accuracy in some ways, so why would he just grossly misrepresent Buddhism? Well, it's because he didn't want us to get into the weeds, right? He didn't want us to start thinking, well, maybe Buddhists would do this, and this is the actual element of real Buddhism that would support this idea. Kind of like how the science of the stars going out is inaccurate, the presentation of the religion is inaccurate. And it's in order to make us think about it as any religion, as any ideological system. And by ideological system, I mean liberal, conservative, socialist, communist, capitalist, anything that dictates a system of beliefs that people use to make sense of the world that is not science, that is not evidence-based. So those types of systems are what employ the evidence-based designed technology. Do you agree with me? Have you read this story? Does it make sense? Do you see something else in the story? Is there something that I missed? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't read 9 Billion Names of God, you can find the whole thing online through your old friend Google. And I hope you do. Thank you.